Ryan Grim, a reporter for The Intercept, got a chance to go to the White House and ask Jen Psaki some questions about exactly what the U.S. strategy is right now in pushing for a potential diplomatic solution to the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the question that he's going to ask is actually going to be at the end of this 4-minute video that we're about to watch here, because the bulk of it, before we get to Ryan Grim's good question pushing for, peace and diplomacy, etc., every question before that was coming from the rest of the White House correspondents was literally just pure hawkishness, pushing for a military response or an escalation on top of what we have already done so far to respond to Russia's invasion. So let's just go ahead and jump into this compilation because it is absolutely wild.
Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials have made so clear that what they believe they need the most is more warplanes and fighter jets. So why is the U.S. assessing something different? Why does the U.S. believe they know better what Ukraine needs than what Ukrainian officials are saying they need the most?
It sounds like, we're pretty dug in on our position when it comes to the no-fly zone, when it comes to the MiGs, despite this growing bipartisan call in Congress to shift a little bit. So, to put it bluntly, is Zelensky wasting his time tomorrow asking for these things?
President Zelensky is going to be speaking to Congress tomorrow. He's been pushing for fighter jets, a no-fly zone. You have to hear some of those same requests tomorrow as well. Has the administration shifted on that at all?
Estonia, though, calling for a no-fly zone. They're a NATO member. They share a border with Russia. How do we view their calls for a no-fly zone?
And on President Zelensky's address tomorrow, of course, he is expected to ask for more assistance, as my colleague noted. A lot of the U.S. positions on that haven't changed, as you just said, when it comes to the no-fly zone. But on the aircraft specifically, the Pentagon said last week that Secretary Austin said they do not support the transfer of additional fighter aircraft at this time. Is that still the United States' position?
Would a strike in Poland on supplies or anything really automatically be met with a forceful response, or simply a conversation amongst allies about how to respond?
There are reports that a Russian drone made its way into Polish airspace before going back to Ukraine and being shot down. Does a drone into Poland count?
Former ambassador to Ukraine, Maria Ivanovich, has been quite outspoken recently, and she said we need to mitigate risk, but it's also true that not taking greater action comes with a risk as well, because Putin is a bully and he only understands strength. Is the president showing enough strength against Putin? If Putin were to use chemical weapons, would it change the president's thinking when it comes to these MiGs, taking the no-fly zone off the table, but at least on this issue? Are you prepared? Can you give us any more details about what that threat means of severe consequences? The president obviously made the same threat last week. Is that purely economic consequences, or would there potentially be a military threat? Go ahead.
So, aside from the request for weapons, President Zelensky has also requested that the U.S. be more involved in negotiations toward a peaceful resolution to the war. What is the U.S. doing to push those negotiations forward?
Well, one of the steps we've taken, a significant one, is to be the largest provider of military and humanitarian and economic assistance in the world, to put them in a greater position of strength as they go into these negotiations. We also engage and talk to the Ukrainians on a daily basis, and the president and this national security team has rallied the world in being unified in their opposition to the actions of President Putin. So those are the steps we're taking. We also engage oftentimes before and after any conversations that any of these global leaders are having with both Russians and Ukrainians, and encourage them to make sure they're engaging with Ukrainians directly.
Would Zelensky be empowered by the United States to reach an agreement with Russia and have U.S. sanctions released as a result?
Well, he's the leader of Ukraine, so he's empowered to have a negotiation with Russia, and we're here to support those efforts.
That's a yes.
Again, I'm not going to get ahead of a negotiation, but we are here to support those efforts. We discuss and have conversations with his team on a daily basis.
Okay, so there's a fuck ton to say about that entire, compilation that we had. That was all from one day. We had like 6, 7 different reporters, some of them doubling up on their questions, literally just asking the same exact goddamn question over and over and over again, which is, in a very simplified way, why are we not starting World War III? I mean, that's what all of these journalists were just asking on repeat, okay? Both in the sense of escalating the conflict by sending fighter jets that would likely have to deploy from NATO allied countries, okay, which Russia has openly stated would be seen as an entrance to the war of those NATO countries, which would then inevitably escalate towards a conflict between NATO and Russia. So the planes being transferred is not something that should be legitimately considered to be on the table. Now, the other thing that they were focusing on there is still the goddamn no-fly zone. Do people not understand what a no-fly zone is? I mean, still, after this deep into this conversation, Joe Biden openly came out and said exactly what it was just a couple days ago when he was giving his address to these same goddamn reporters, right? If you're going to enforce a no-fly zone, that means what? It means U.S. or NATO allied forces are going to have to shoot Russian planes out of the sky. That is a declaration of war, okay? And an entrance towards World War III and towards a nuclear confrontation between two superpowers that have enough nukes to completely annihilate all life on Earth, okay? So when you're asking these questions over and over and over again, just pushing from the most hawkish perspective possible, then this is only going to push those people who are in power, members of Congress or the president, to take those more hawkish actions. I mean, they don't even reference the fact that what they're calling for is a declaration of World War III. I mean, it would be a lot simpler if they would just come out and say that and just say, hey, why isn't President Biden declaring World War III right now? And that would be a much easier way to interpret what they're actually calling for right now. And so you see that with the contrast from what Ryan Grimm was saying at the end as a contrast to that question, and just asking very basics like, you know, what are you doing to push forward diplomacy? What are you doing to try to have some sort of a peace agreement reached? And on top of that, the most important thing of what he was saying there, which I think Jen Psaki completely failed to elaborate on, is, you know, does the country of Ukraine have the authority granted by the U.S. to go negotiate with Russia in exchange for sanctions relief? That should be openly outlined. That should be something you are screaming from the rooftops if you are actually trying to produce a diplomatic solution to the ongoing invasion, right? You have to outline exactly for Vladimir Putin, here is X, Y, and Z concessions that you have to make right now in order for us to release X, Y, and Z sanctions. Otherwise, there is no off-ramp and everything is just going to be seen as escalatory, and Vladimir Putin is never going to believe that he's actually going to get sanctions relief, and he's only going to double down and triple down on continuing the invasion and continuing the war, which leads me to my next point, which is in the broader picture of all of this, right? And, you know, I like, you know, everybody understands that you want to be optimistic for the Ukrainian people and you want to believe that they will be able to, you know, push back the violent Russian invaders. But a lot of that is just, you know, people getting caught up in the moment and thinking something is, you know, going to happen that is completely unrealistic. And I'm sorry to bring this realism, but Ukraine does not stand a chance. If Vladimir Putin wants to take Kyiv, if he wants to take Kharkiv, that is just a matter of time. That is not something where Ukraine can come out the other side completely victorious. It's just a matter of how these negotiations are going to go, and if they fail, Vladimir Putin will double down on the war effort and will take over those cities, which would then likely lead to a sustained counterinsurgency from Ukrainian forces that would be absolutely catastrophic for the domestic Ukrainian population. That is not something that people should be striving for. That's not something that people should be pushing for. So the point of me saying that isn't just to be nihilistic and say that Ukraine should just throw their hands up and not defend themselves or not try to, you know, retain some sort of sovereignty for the country. Not at all. The whole point is to say the military equipment that we are flooding into Ukraine at record levels that have never been seen since World War II, okay? And on top of that, the sanctions as well, we've already deployed the nuclear sanctions, is what they were calling, you know, cutting Russia off from the SWIFT banking system. We already went all out as much as we possibly can without starting World War III in terms of military support and in terms of economic punishment for Russia. So there is no more, you know, next step that we can necessarily go without risking an escalation towards World War III. And so these are important questions that you should be able to openly answer so that there could be some sort of a diplomatic off-ramp and there could actually be a solution to this war that doesn't involve creating Ukraine into, you know, Afghanistan 2.0 with a violent and bloody sustained counterinsurgency for years, okay? That is not the preferable solution. The preferable solution is peace. And so if at the end of the day, the military support, the economic sanctions are supposed to be pushing us towards peace, that should be the first question on everybody's mind. The first question shouldn't be, how can we further escalate the war? How can we further escalate and bring us that much closer to a nuclear confrontation? The question that every reporter should be asking is, what exactly is the diplomatic off-ramp? What exactly is the X, Y, and Z that you are willing to give to Putin in terms of sanctions relief in exchange for him, withdrawing Russian troops and ending the invasion? That should be the only question that these reporters are asking, and yet only one of them. I mean, Ryan Grimm, the only person in that entire press pool who is actually asking a substantive question. Now, I got a little bit of an update here for you guys in terms of the negotiations and how far they've moved along. I don't want to overhype it, but there has been some positive, movement in the right direction. So here from Common Dreams, Jake Johnson, he says Russian and Ukrainian negotiators are reportedly moving in the direction of a 15-point peace deal that would involve Kyiv formally renouncing its ambition to join NATO and accepting limits on its armed forces in exchange for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of Moscow's troops, and security guarantees from the West. And they say the broad and tentative framework of the deal was first reported on Wednesday by the Financial Times, which noted that Ukraine and Russia's delegations have made significant progress, so that's good to see, toward an agreement, while stressing that potentially major obstacles remain. And they say, according to the Financial Times, in addition to Ukraine dropping its goal of NATO membership, which is enshrined in the country's constitution, the diplomatic settlement would involve Kyiv promising not to host foreign military bases or weaponry in exchange for protection from allies such as the US, the UK, and Turkey, which, this is where we get to the part where it's kind of complicated and it's unclear exactly what Russia or Vladimir Putin would be willing to give up in terms of, Western security guarantees. I don't think he's going to be willing to, have any sort of military alliance between the West and Ukraine. It seems like that was pretty much one of the main reasons why he ended up invading the country in the first place. So, I think the major sticking points here are going to be the territories in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, maybe having or recognizing those as independent territories, as well as recognizing Crimea as part of Russia, and then, a guarantee to never join NATO, never join the EU, etc. It seems like those are the main sticking points. And then from the Russian perspective, obviously withdrawing troops and, having a ceasefire and ending your bombarding. And on top of that, you're going to have some sort of a rebuilding of all of the massive amounts of civilian and otherwise infrastructure that has been completely destroyed throughout this invasion so far. And just as a reminder, Russia is committing widespread war crimes in this invasion. They have been basically consistently since the beginning, after they, escalated beyond just military targets. But these are just some of the recent ones in the last couple of days. Residential areas hit in Kyiv, leaving at least 4 dead. More than half of Kyiv's 3 million inhabitants have fled the city since the start of the Russian offensive. And also there was this one, a pregnant woman and a baby unfortunately died after Russia bombed a maternity ward. So again, brazen war crimes. If you call it out when the U.S. does it in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria, you should call it out when Russia does it in Ukraine. So, those are the updates that I got for you guys. The media ecosystem here in the United States, of course, as usual, being as hawkish as physically possible, trying to push the Biden administration to shift their positions to basically escalate the likelihood that we would end up with a direct confrontation between Russia and the West. And I mean, literally, it just boils down to this. Do you think nuclear annihilation would be better for the people of Ukraine than what's happening right now? And the answer to that, in any case, is no. It wouldn't be better for Ukraine. It wouldn't be better for Russia. It wouldn't be better for the United States or life on the planet. Okay, so nothing is worse than nuclear annihilation, and yet you still have reporters for all of these major outlets. There was, a CNN reporter, an MSNBC reporter, an AP News reporter that I saw in those clips, and they're just casually calling for World War III as if it's nothing, as if it's just, something casual that we can do on the side and participate in a war against another nuclear-armed superpower, as if it's just not going to have any consequences. So thankfully, Ryan Grimm, at least one person in the room, is asking some decent questions. And, I would look forward or hope that the Biden administration actually puts forward a concrete plan in place to say, yes, Zelensky, you can go and make negotiations or concessions in exchange for U.S. sanctions relief, because that is the off-ramp that will inevitably, or at least hopefully, bring an actual peaceful end to this conflict.